Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Calibration Program Best Practices. We want to encourage feedback, questions, and discussion around the topic. You can type a question and send it to us through the question panel. There will be time at the end of the webinar for questions as well. The recording from today's webinar will be made available for Blue Mountain customers in the Blue Mountain Help Center. Today's topic, Calibration Program Best Practices, is co-presented by Dave Porrell, Principal, Global Advanced Service at Blue Mountain, and Ryan Culp, Vice President at Qantas. I would like to turn it over to our presenters to introduce themselves to our audience.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dave Porrell. As Chris said, I work with him in the Advanced Global Services team at Blue Mountain. On the screen, you can see some of my qualifications and letters that I've accumulated over the years. My career so far spans about 35 years in industry, of which about 19 of those years have been spent in life science in a number of different organizations. The industries that I've worked in over the years include beer, pharmaceutical, sugar, biofuels, and some time in the consulting world. Overall, my career has focused on maintenance and reliability, and that's the area that I consider to be my specialist subject. Chris?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm sure many of you who are attending today may know me. I've been in industry for 33 years, 23 in the life sciences industry, both food and life sciences throughout my career. And my path has taken me a lot of different directions. Some refer to me as a unicorn in the industry. I do look at myself as a CMMS specialist, asset lifecycle, preventive maintenance, calibration compliance, cost saving, and continuous improvement subject matter expert. Deployed a lot of systems over the years and have really joined Blue Mountain, providing that expertise and supporting our customers from that aspect of things. Ryan.
Ryan.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, my name is Ryan Culp. I'm the Vice President of Qantas. Qantas is a partner of Blue Mountain. At the beginning of my career, I attended Lincoln Technical Institute, where I studied electronical engineering. And at the beginning of my career, I began as a field service calibration technician, performing a variety of general laboratory and process equipment services within the life sciences industry. And as my career continued, I began running service teams as a senior project manager and got exposure to other critical services in our industry, such as certification, environmental monitoring, and validation. This allowed me to really understand the technical service needs of our industry and how to properly maintain the calibration and maintenance program to really ensure compliance to a variety of regulatory requirements. In 2012, my business partner, Dan Quinlan, and I founded Qantas, which has now grown to about 67 employees, servicing 350 customers in the Mid-Atlantic region. Our company provides a variety of on-site technical services, in addition to off-site metrology and microbiology laboratory testing services. Today, my role at Qantas is more centered around overseeing the day-to-day operations of our field and laboratory divisions.
Okay, before we go any further, we'd like to start off with a poll, not a Highland Games poll, as you see this fellow holding, but an opinion poll. I think Chris has the details of that poll, which he's going to share on the screen now.
It looks like we're up and ready to go. And answers are coming in, which is great. I appreciate the participation. Give it a little bit more and we will share them momentarily. We've got 77% voted. Gonna give it a few more seconds for let the rest of the team get in there, navigate their way to answer the poll. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up here. And let's share. There we go. There's our responses. So predominantly 42% pharmaceutical, as you see, 12% biologics, nice 19%, and cell and gene therapies, 19%, more than one above, which I like as well, and 9% medical devices. Great. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate that.
Super. Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everyone, for your responses. I would just like to give a brief overview of Blue Mountain at this point before we hand over to Ryan. The name Blue Mountain applies to both the company and the software system that we produce. Blue Mountain is a leading developer of asset management software and services for the life sciences industry. We focus specifically on life sciences and strive to ensure that our product is the system of choice for companies operating in this sector. So a few notes about the Blue Mountain RAM system. Firstly, RAM stands for Regulatory Asset Manager. The package combines functionality for calibration, maintenance, and asset management into one integrated system. The latest release is hosted in the cloud. One of the features that we are particularly proud of is that the software comes fully validated by Blue Mountain. This validation package has withstood the scrutiny of the FDA in hundreds of customer audits over many years. To date, the RAM system has been implemented in well over 1,000 facilities worldwide and still growing. Blue Mountain RAM ensures the integrity of your data and compliance with the FDA's good manufacturing practices. We use a GAMP5 approach for qualification and validation of automated process systems to ensure that the software solution remains scalable and compliant. Finally, we provide not only an extremely capable software solution, but we support this with a world-class customer experience and in-house support from our technical team. This webinar is brought to you by our advanced services team. Together, we have extensive industry experience in maintenance, reliability, and EAM systems, which means that we can help our customers leverage the features of Blue Mountain RAM, combined with industry best practices to optimize their asset management programs. Enough about Blue Mountain. I'll now hand over to Ryan to take us through the content of the presentation.
Hi, well, thank you, Dave. Yeah, today we're here to share our knowledge with you on how to build a sustainable and calibration maintenance management program. We're going to understand how to evaluate risks and trends within that program, and we're going to take some time to highlight how to use the power of Blue Mountain RAM to really maximize your program's efficiency. So the team here today really does have a strong understanding of the importance of this topic within regulated industries, and we personally have helped many organizations maintain compliance and improve their processes. And today we hope to really share our knowledge and insights with you and provide valuable information that you can use in your own work. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to an informative and engaging presentation. So we want to start today's lesson off with building a sustainable calibration and maintenance management program. During my 20 years in the industry, I've seen companies do this really well and others really struggle with getting something off the ground. Blue Mountain RAM is an excellent resource to inject into your operation, but without a well-defined program, companies can really struggle to operate a program that's in an audit-ready state. So we wanted to take a majority of the time today to outline what we typically recommend customers have within their calibration and maintenance management programs. So from a 30,000-foot view, the program could really be broken out into 3 simple categories. The first one is going to be establishing your procedures. So the one we're going to talk a lot about today is your master program SOP. That's going to be an overarching procedure that oversees the entire program. If you have in-house FTE servicing your calibration devices, that's going to be your calibration and maintenance level SOPs and work instructions. And of course, we also always have some safety programs that are going to be wrapped around the program. Moving down the next area, performing and documenting your actions. In the life sciences industry, if it wasn't documented, it never happened. So we have to make sure that we're having a robust documentation process out there. But if your documentation is lacking, you're really going to have some struggles in audits. And then finally, you're going to want to take some time to approve the outcome of these actions. You're going to want to take time to identify roles within your organization that have responsibilities that are critical for these actions. And it keeps that process moving forward, and it's going to hold people accountable for their respective actions and responsibilities. So this is an overview of typical components that we see within a compliant calibration and maintenance management program. When establishing a new program or helping to restructure an existing program at customer sites, these are the key areas that we really look for. We're going to spend time on each one and dig deeper into the coming slides, but from an overview, we're going to take a look into the master program SOP, what you're going to have in that SOP as a written and defined program that you follow on a day-to-day operation. We're going to cover a master equipment list. It's a very important part of any program, and we're going to cover what's typically on those lists in good detail. Instrument classification. This is a really important part to various aspects of the program. However, unfortunately, it is a typically underutilized part. We're going to talk a little bit how to make it easier for you to implement. We're going to cover tolerances and how to establish those tolerances. And when something is outside of a tolerance during a calibration, how do you react to that? What do you do in an event of an OOT? We're going to discuss intervals and how risk assessments and instrument classification will help you to define those particular intervals. ID and tagging we're going to cover, and it's going to be more than just calibration labels. We're going to talk about no calibration required and other different labels that we're going to put on our instruments. We're going to spend some time on discipline-based SOPs. So if you have some internal calibration support through full-time employees, we're going to talk about how to keep those SOPs focused around the discipline of testing to really reduce the number of SOPs that you have throughout your quality system. And finally, we're going to cover history files in both electronic and paper versions. And we're going to spend some time talking about full-time employees versus vendors and how to handle their work differently in Blue Mountain RAM. So why a master program SOP? So we see a lot of companies and service a lot of companies that use a 100% outsourcing model with all vendors and no full-time employees. Regardless, federal regulations like CFR 21 Part 211 is going to define those customers to have a written program designed to assure proper performance. And this is going to be the responsibility of the company that owns the equipment being serviced, not the service provider. And by having a master program SOP, it's really going to help you better define calibration and PM program oversight and control, and a program that will be in an audit-ready state with defined measurements and metrics. So in the coming slides, we'll review all the various aspects of what we typically see in master program SOPs. Starting off with master equipment lists, this is going to be a standard audit request and is an important metric to maintain in a compliant program. We see a ton of different types of lists coming out of a CMMS database, such as Blue Mountain RAM, Excel, and even Word. But I really wouldn't recommend, starting with Word. I've seen that before. It can really get away from you. Additionally, these lists can contain a ton of information. So you're going to want to do your best not to overload the master equipment list with unnecessary data. With solutions like RAM, you can set up different reports for queries. And in a master equipment list, we're typically going to talk about keeping it simple with items listed here on the slide. So the first one we have listed is an identification number. That's clearly important to understand what equipment is due for calibration and lives within your facility. And if you're using a parent-child relationship, which we'll talk about later, you can choose to include both ID numbers or just the single child ID. When you're covering your descriptions, you're going to want to really do your best to keep your descriptions simple and consistent, using things like temperature transmitter or pressure gauge for all those various instruments. And you're going to want to try to avoid over-descriptive nomenclatures. It could really be inconsistent throughout the system. Boilerplate data such as manufacturer model and serial number, department and location are a critical parameter. We typically also like to see status on your master equipment list so that you can tell very quickly if a particular piece of equipment is active, inactive, or in a retired state. And finally, one key piece of information is your service information. The service type, interval, and due dates are all very important information you should be able to pull very quickly from your master equipment list.
Now we have poll number 2. And again, Chris is going to flash the poll up on the screen. The question we're asking here is, has your facility done some form of criticality assessment in the past to rank the importance of each asset or system to the overall business?
Again, getting some good, fast responses. We have about 65% of everybody voted. We'll give it a little bit more time. Still got a few more voting. I'll give it another few seconds and we're going to close it out. All right, interesting. There we go. So here's our numbers, which interesting. 70% say yes and 30% say no. So I think that's, you know, it's, Ryan, I'm glad to see 70% are doing this. I'd be very interested in some of the methodologies.
Okay, thank you, Chris. And let's go back to the next slide for Ryan.
Yeah, that is a really interesting outcome on that poll, because when we see and we're visiting customers, we're finding that what we're calling equipment classifications or criticality assessments is one of the more underutilized tools in a program. And it is a very important process because not all equipment or instruments are created equally or equally important to the process. And companies can really waste a lot of time and effort investigating out of tolerances on equipment that's not critical. So defining those equipment classifications can really lead to more effective out of tolerance investigations. And the classification of these instruments is going to be typically an output of your risk assessment that we're going to cover a little later. From a real high level overview, we're trying to put instruments into two categories. It's going to be your critical equipment that's going to have a direct impact on product, patient, or safety. So you want to think about a sterilization temperature probe on an autoclave. If we were to find that out of tolerance during a calibration, we could have a direct quality event related to the sterilization of materials or products. And then non-critical equipment, this may have like a secondary impact to your process or a non-quality related parameter. So if we stick with that same autoclave example, we could think of a pressure gauge on the jacket of the autoclave. If this unit happened to be out of tolerance, it most likely would not impact the sterilization process, but it could be an indicator into other attributes of the system that may have been affected. Digging deeper into equipment classifications, we're typically going to recommend the following classifications as a starting point in any program. Now, each site is different depending on product production outputs and risks related to patient health and safety. And we do see a wide variety of classifications in the industry. Keep in mind, there's no one size fits all answer. These are just things that we will look at as a starting point. So GMP critical devices that we just talked about in the previous slide, those are going to be devices that have a direct impact on product quality. Think about that autoclave sterilization probe example we used previously. When we get into non-GMP critical devices, we tend to like to break them out a little bit further to make any investigations a little bit easier. So a process or system critical device, going back to that autoclave jacket pressure example, if the chamber, a lot of autoclaves have steam that are fed from the jacket into the chamber. So if the jacket pressure was off a little bit, it could affect the chamber pressure, which could affect product quality output. So it's going to be an indicator to look into a couple other instruments on the device. Safety and environmental critical devices. This is something you want to think about like an oxygen meter in a liquid nitrogen storage area. If this equipment is not accurate, an employee could unknowingly be exposed to a dangerous environment, which is obviously important. However, it would have no impact on product quality, making your OT investigations a little bit quicker. And then finally, under non-GMP critical, we have a business critical asset. And a good example of this would be a pH probe on a wastewater pit. If not properly maintained, a business may face fines from regulatory agencies such as the EPA for not maintaining a proper wastewater, but of course wouldn't have any impact on product quality. And then finally, we have no impact equipment. These items are going to be items in your R&D lab that don't really fit in any classifications above. I wanted to put in a quick slide here to talk about laboratory equipment. And in the CFRs, it's going to directly talk about laboratory equipment and that it should undergo the same level of scrutiny as manufacturing equipment. There's a lot of companies out there that will do product testing and release in GLP, QC labs. So a lot of the instrumentation that you guys are using are going to be just as critical as the equipment that is in the manufacturing facility. So the key takeaway here from this particular slide is you're going to want to apply your program to each of your instruments equally throughout the facility. So talking about scheduling tools. So if you're already using a CMMS database like Blue Mountain RAM, you really understand the importance of how critical a scheduling tool could be. A lot of users start off, and especially in smaller startup biopharmas, in Excel. And that's a great place to start, but it's going to have a lot of trouble scaling with an organization as it grows. So with that, we're always going to recommend evaluating a CMMS like the Blue Mountain RAM to really support your program. Some of the benefits of a scheduling tool are going to be automated reminders. This is going to automate the scheduling process, reducing those manual efforts and risk of errors of data entry into an Excel file. There's going to be some cost savings. It's going to help with preventative maintenance, really reducing the likelihood of costly breakdowns because it's going to keep people more tuned in on the scheduled services that are happening. Transparency is a big one. Having multiple users be able to log in, it's really going to help provide a clear view of equipment status and maintenance activities to all of the relevant stakeholders, something that's going to be a struggle if you're not using a shared file like an Excel file. And then compliance. So it really does going to assist in meeting regulatory requirements for equipment and maintain long-term record keeping. When you have an auditor from a regulatory agency coming in, you're using a system like Blue Mountain RAM, they know that you have good control of your program and good control of your schedule. Getting into establishing tolerances on the next slide here. So calibration tolerances are really critical for ensuring that the equipment used in the production process operates within those specified limits. And establishing calibration tolerances can be a multi-step approach and process. And as a calibration service provider, this is one of the biggest questions we get when we're out servicing clients. So what we're typically going to recommend is the manufacturer's tolerance is a really good place to start. But I'm saying to beware of those accuracies because they might be too tight for your respective process. So as you're looking at what the manufacturer specifies, you're also going to want to kind of keep it focused around the process that instrumentation is actually measuring. So in most cases, if you understand the process tolerance, we're going to recommend that your calibration tolerance is half of your process tolerance. So for example, if you have a -80 freezer that you validated to ±10 for uniformity as the process tolerance, we would recommend calibrating that as a tolerance of ±5. And then talking about process tolerances, this is another difficult task that not a lot of customers can employ. However, if you are able to establish this, we're going to want to talk about keeping them mainly around GMP critical devices because it's going to reduce the overall population that you have to evaluate, and it's going to really help you in OOT investigations. In general, if the UUT or the unit under test was outside of the calibration tolerance, but not outside of that defined process tolerance, you're going to have a lot more confidence that there was a no impact to your product that occurred during that service. So how do you establish these tolerances? Again, like I said, this is a big question that we get. So the first one up there is a user specification. This is not always in place for smaller instrumentation. Typically, we see URSs that are put in place for bigger systems like autoclaves or Wi-Fi systems or clean steam generators. So if you're really working on just like a balance or a temperature transmitter in a system, you could start with a risk assessment. And this is a really important part of the process to understand the criticality of the device. You're going to want to focus on the parameters of the equipment controls. And in general, items that have a higher risk would have a lower tolerance related to the process. And then conversely, the items that have a lower risk are allowed to have a little bit of a wider tolerance. Again, for reviewing specifications, we're going to recommend consulting with the manufacturer's tolerances. And just as important as making sure it's not too tight for the process, we also want to make sure that we're not setting a tolerance that's below manufacturer specifications. A lot of equipment is sold based on the accuracy of the device as like a marketing purpose. So they may not always be practical in manufacturers' operations. So again, keep it focused around the process. If you're able to reference an industry standard, that's a really good place to start. Some industry standards that we typically look at are ISO guidelines in the industry, something like ISO 8655 for pipettes or ISO 21501 for particle counters. Those documents are really great references because they talk about the exact tests and accuracies that you should be following for your testing. Again, process requirements, in our opinion, this is going to be the best place to start. If you know the process, the safe bet is going to be having that process tolerance for your calibration tolerance. That way, if you're outside of that, again, you're not directly impacting your manufacturing operations. So whatever you decide from a documentation standpoint, we're going to suggest that customers document that decision on calibration and process tolerances within your CMMS or on an equipment master record. It is going to be the responsibility of the customer to maintain this information, and auditors do routinely ask where this information came from. And then finally, review and update. You're going to want to periodically review these tolerances as a good practice. It is rarely exercised, but if you're experiencing a lot of out of tolerance events, this might be a good time to review the applied acceptance criteria.
And Ryan, I just want to add to this, when we're looking at tolerances, if we don't know the process tolerance, I've seen many use the manufacturer's tolerance of the instrument. And typically what you'll experience is a lot of out of tolerances at that point. So again, think about it and then have a discussion. If you don't have a URS or a process tolerance, have a discussion with your manufacturing team or the end user to understand where they're using that instrument and where you would calibrate it, because you do want it to be greater than the manufacturer's specified accuracy.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. That's a really good point. And as instruments are getting better and better coming from manufacturers, they're going to start bumping up against accuracies of field calibration equipment. So again, remember, they're marketing the instrument based on accuracies, so that you don't always need to follow that specifically. And that brings us into out of tolerance investigation responses. And this is a real critical part of the program. So if a device is found outside the acceptance criteria, it must be investigated for potential product impact, especially if it's in the manufacturing or GLP areas and it's involved with product testing and release. And these investigations should be carried out by the QA or process system owner, not the calibration technician. The calibration technician is the subject matter expert. They can assist with the information into the investigation, but they can't lead those efforts. And again, if you have an established process tolerance, you can really leverage that to determine potential product impact. It's also important to note that not all OOT events will require the same level of investigation. So the example I have up on the screen here is an air sampler. So if we're taking an air sampler into a clean room, we're using that to sample for over the next 3 to 6 months. We send that out for calibration, and the calibration provider finds that that air sampler was actually running too high, meaning it was sampling too much air. So as long as it didn't contribute to excessive growth on your plates, that's not a bad failure. You're oversampling. It's way better than undersampling. So you can kind of take the time to really understand how the unit would failed calibration, and you can leverage that in your OOT investigation. Getting into setting and reviewing service intervals, again, the best place to initially start is your OEM recommendation. Manufacturers typically know their equipment best and what type of drift to expect over time. So in most cases, we see that manufacturers are stating at minimum 12 months, you should be calibrating or performing a preventative maintenance on your service. But you tend to want to look a little bit deeper on the process requirement and your risk assessment. So what we typically see and recommend in the industry for critical equipment, you should be testing that every 3 to 6 months. And then non-critical equipment can be pushed out to every 12 months. On average, we typically see services are performed every 6 to 12 months, with those super critical devices performed every 3 months. We've also gotten a lot of questions over the years going beyond 12 months and when that is acceptable. And it really boils down to a few items. Your risk assessment, of course, for potential impact areas, and then the inherent stability or historic stability of the instrument. So if you're using something like a physical go, no-go gauge, that may only require testing every 3 to 5 years because it's a physical device. It doesn't have electronic drift. And if it's not damaged, in most cases, it's going to have a good amount of stability. And then reviewing service intervals. Why would we want or need to do this? Well, the historical data of your equipment holds a significant number of value for a variety of reasons. And one basic example is the performance of pass-fail results. This is going to allow you to track the performance of your equipment over time and can really help you identify trends, anomalies, and patterns within that instrument. In the category of service intervals, we're typically going to monitor them to when we need to shorten them or lengthen them depending on the performance of the device. And in general, what we recommend is if an instrument is going to fail calibration 2 or 3 times in a row, we're going to look to reduce that interval typically by half. And then we're going to perform calibration at that halved interval for 2 or 3 more times. And if it successfully passes calibration, you can evaluate it for restoring the device to the original interval. And typically, that's what we see, and that's how people handle it. It's going to be up to you guys and kind of the historical performance of the device.
And Ryan, you know, you brought up a valid point earlier. From a historical standpoint, right? Rely on your subject matter experts, such as people like Ryan and people at your site who have a long time, history with instrumentation. Things like a CO2 sensor in an incubator, we know drifts frequently, right? That's just the nature of that instrument. So yeah, you're going to want to calibrate that quarterly, because I've seen that and I know from my history. I would calibrate that quarterly. So think about your instruments and rely on your subject matter experts as a guide as well.
Yeah, it's very good advice. Thank you, Chris. So we were going to mention identification and tagging, and this is an area where things can get really wild. I've seen all types of ID nomenclature, from smart identifications that tell you where the facility is located in, the parent system it's on, the device ID of the instrument, and then a control number. I've seen device-specific identification numbers such as scale number 1 or pipette number 57, or more simply, we've seen just a unique, non-related sequential number that comes out of a CMMS database. The only thing we're typically gonna not recommend using is the instrument serial number. A lot of companies, when they get started, don't have an ID number system, so they just default to the serial number. It's a difficult practice because not all serial numbers may be unique from manufacturer to manufacturer, and in some equipment, they may not exist altogether. So whatever system you decide to go with for your identification system, make sure it's documented within your master program SOP, make sure people are training on that, and that it's readily available for reference as you're adding instruments to your program. If you are using a CMMS database to generate sequential numbers in your system, we're typically going to recommend a parent-child ID number system. So for the example on the slide, we have ID number 1234, which would be your parent. Say that's an autoclave. And just like one parent can have many children, an autoclave can have many instruments. So your parent ID would be that 1234, and then we would use a 001 or 002 control number for all the other respective instrumentations that are on that. In the case of where you have just a single device, such as a balance or a scale or a pipette, that would just receive the parent ID. And for instruments, as far as tagging, so for instruments that are in the CMMS that have an ID, you're also going to want to have a defined label on them. And service labels are the most basic identification of tagging. If an instrument requires routine service, it should always be tagged with its status. And this would be your CAL or preventative maintenance label. If that device were to fail calibration or be out of service, you're going to want to be able to label it as well and have those labels defined within your CMMS your calibration and maintenance management program, so that in this event, people know what to do and they can tag the instrument with a status so nobody uses it. And of course, if we have calibration not required or for reference only, we're also going to want to take a little time to identify those. We do get a lot of questions about that last one, or when or what should I sticker with no calibration required? Some customers have a ton of instrumentation all throughout their facility with their HVAC systems that don't require calibration. So what we typically will recommend, the thought of identifying all those is like paralyzing, because there could be thousands of instruments that we're not testing. So you can kind of take a visible equipment in your GMP areas that don't require calibration. Those are the ones that you should really focus on. They should have an equipment master record to document the decision that no calibration required it. It should be identified, and then it should be labeled with a no calibration required sticker. That'll really help you from focusing on all the instruments in your program and harnessing it down to what's important. So talking about equipment master records, what should typically be on these devices, on these documents? So we typically will see the boilerplate information, manufacturer, model, serial number, location, but it's also really important to include your service requirements, such as calibration or PM. It should include the parameters and specifications or the test points and tolerances that you're going to be doing when you're testing that instrument. It should also include your service interval. And typically we like to see a note section on that document, because no matter what you put on that document as a form, you're not always going to have all the forms that you need. So having a note section will really help. And as far as storing this, a lot of CMMS databases will allow you to store this information right in the CMMS database, such as Blue Mountain RAM. But if you're using a paper history file, I have some examples in the next coming slides on where to store it.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. We're going to give Ryan's voice a breather for a moment, and we're going to have our third poll of the session. One could argue that with this many polls, we could start our own scaffolding business. Chris is going to flash that poll up on the screen now. The question, at your facility, do you have a CMMS to store your equipment maintenance and calibration information? If you wouldn't mind giving us a response there, we'll have a look at the results. Thank you.
The results are coming in. We have about 40% voted. I'd like to see about 80%, and we're climbing, so we're getting there. Another 5 seconds, and we're going to close it. Okay. Here are our results. 66% say yes, and we use it extensively. 29% yes, but we only use it to a limited extent. And 4% no, we use a combination of spreadsheets and paper.
Thank you, Chris. Very interesting. Thanks, everybody, for your responses. Back to you, Ryan.
Yeah, that's really good information, guys. Thank you for participating. So I just want to take a quick moment to talk about equipment master records and what they typically look like and showcase one on the screen. Again, these can really vary greatly from customer to customer. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. It's what works best for your facility. But as you can see in this example, we have all that boilerplate master equipment data, and then we also have the service requirements below. So anyone looking at this record could quickly define, what kind of testing is required, where this instrument is located, how often are we servicing it. And this is a good reference for you guys to kind of use in your own work. All right, discipline level SOPs. So I'm going to take a moment here and kind of talk about this a little bit before we get into history files. So if you have an internal calibration division, you're also typically going to want to have discipline-based calibration SOPs. And when we call them discipline-based SOPs, because we really recommend keep writing them and focusing around the service function of the equipment. So this would be like general pressure, general temperature calibrations, and you're going to want to avoid writing calibration procedures that are device specific on a particular incubator model or centrifuge model. That could really balloon the number of SOPs in your program and create a really difficult training environment when you're bringing in new employees. Each SOP should really include items such as like standards, equipment, materials that are required, setup and pre-inspection requirements, what type of calibration process should be carried out for that particular type of instrument, the number of test points you're doing, how you handle as found, as left measurements, and then post-verification activities such as review of data, labeling requirements, and how you're going to return these particular instruments back to service so the manufacturing team can utilize them. So coming into history files, as you know, proper storage of these files is really critical to your process. As you're defining them within your master program SOP, you want to be careful not to conflict with other site documentation control procedures. And typical outputs of this are going to be your equipment master records, service records or certificates, and some customers will use like a change request form that they'll file with the instrument if they're using that to update intervals or tolerances. And these history files should obviously be stored in a secure location that's protected from fire or water damage if you're storing a hard copy. They should be easily identified with an ID number and readily accessible during audits. Obviously, there's a big push in the industry for electronic records, but we see a lot of companies that still struggle to get this off the ground. Some people are still working within paper systems that do thousands of calibrations a year. And some customers actually file both electronically and paper. So it's really up to your site requirements and risk tolerances. Again, there's not one size fits all answer as long as you're maintaining a proper history file. In the next slide here, I have an example of what, if you could back up one slide, there, perfect. I have an example of what the history files look like in a paper system. Again, there's a wide variety of storing it, but the one we have up on the screen is the system that we typically work in and recommend doing. It's been very scalable for an organization. So we have a filing cabinet, and in each drawer in the filing cabinet, it's going to denote the range of ID numbers that are in each drawer. Once you open the drawer, there's a bunch of hanging folders with the parent ID on the file. And then within that file, there's subfolders with your instruments that are related to that parent. And then in the individual folders, as you open it up, we'll have the master equipment record on the left-hand side and the calibration certificate or preventive maintenance certificate on the right-hand side with the most recent on top. This method is going to take a little bit longer to file than stuffing things in by month or by binder, but it's going to be a huge time saver in audits when people are asking you to pull history files.
Another note, Ryan, on the paper system is I would just suggest storing all this in an area that has a chemical fire suppression system as opposed to water, because you can easily damage your files from water and lose everything. So another great reason to be electronic as opposed to paper.
Yeah. So I wanted to spend a little time here to talk about in-house full-time employees versus contractors. So we work with a wide variety of customers that their programs use 100% outsourcing model, a large insourcing model that covers, majority of the equipment, and then in most cases we see a mixture of both. So because not all one company can complete all the services, or not one person has the expertise to do the services required. With that, it's really important to understand how to manage both methods, both in your master program SOP and in your CMMS, such as Blue Mountain RAM. And then typically what we see for in-house employees, they're going to be training on your corporate requirements like GDP, dock control, and safety. They'd also be training on your master program SOP and any respective discipline-based SOPs relative to their job title and responsibility. And then they are usually completing their service work in your CMMS database like Blue Mountain RAM. And they're often the on-site liaison for outside contractors because they know the site the best. When you're bringing contractors into your facility, they obviously should be on your approved vendor list for those respective services. And depending on the risk profile of that vendor, you're going to want to perform a paper audit or an in-person audit may be necessary. In most cases, when you bring a contractor in, we're going to recommend that allowing that contractor to work in their database to produce a service record. Unless you're staffing a contractor on site full-time and treating them like a full-time employee, it's going to be difficult to bring all of your contractors in your CMMS database. And we've even seen some OEMs like, I won't name any, but some larger OEM companies that are going to absolutely refuse to work within your system because they're not trained in it. So we typically will say, let them work in their own software, let them produce the record of service, and then have your internal employees document all the MTD data if you're using MDTs, or manage the pass-fail responsibilities in there, and then upload that certificate to Blue Mountain RAM. We get a lot of questions around that, so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about it. So we talked a lot about risk here in the presentation so far, so I wanted to provide some typical areas of risk within your program. So the first one that we talked about the most is your risk assessment. So instruments and equipment are going to be evaluated to determine their impact on product quality and patient safety. This assessment considers a bunch of factors such as the instrument's role in the manufacturing process, the amount of criticality of the measurement it provides, and then those potential consequences if there are inaccurate measurements. Classifications of instruments is typically defined into a couple different risk categories that I have on the screen here. So for high risk instruments, these are going to be instruments that are critical to your product quality and patient safety, and any errors in those instruments can lead to significant health risk or a regulatory non-compliance. The medium risk instrument will have more of a moderate impact on product quality and safety, and those errors may result in quality deviations, but it may not be an immediate health risk. And then your lower risk items are going to be things that have no impact to patient product safety, like in your R&D lab. Also in your risk assessment, this is where you can help identify your calibration frequency. So higher risk instruments may require a service more often, while a lower risk instrument can have a longer interval between services. Continuing with understanding risks and your calibration tolerances. So your higher risk instruments may have a tighter tolerance compared to your lower risk items. In the example on the screen, you have a final product temperature probe, maybe a much higher risk item than you would want to assign a tighter tolerance to than the ambient temperature monitoring probe in the manufacturing area that's monitoring your ambient environment. So whatever you choose, you want to make sure that you're being much aware of your target accuracy ratios or TARs when you are performing your services. So whenever you're assigning those tolerances, you're going to make sure you consider that the calibration instrumentation can keep what we typically like to see, that we call it 4-to-1 accuracy ratio, where your equipment that you're calibrating with is 4 times more accurate than the device you're calibrating. And that way, if your standard were to be out of tolerance during calibration, there's not a direct immediate impact on all the other devices that standard calibrated throughout its life cycle. And then finally, as far as review and continuous improvement, regular reviews of your risk assessment, calibration performance, and associated procedures should be conducted. This will allow you to make adjustments throughout the life cycle of the program as necessary. And Dave, if you want to take the next slide for me, please.
I certainly will. Thank you, Ryan. So Ryan and Chris have talked quite a lot about tolerances and risk so far in the presentation. And I'm going to talk you through this graphic which we put together because this reflects the terms and the way that they are used in many CMMS systems. And Blue Mountain is certainly one of those which uses the terms in this way. And the idea here on this slide is to illustrate the relationship between, or the comparison, if you like, between the different tolerance bands that we've been hearing about. I'm going to work from the bottom of the slide upwards. Each instrument, in terms of its calibration, will have a midpoint, a perfect point at which it would be absolutely in the center of its allowable tolerance for that process. And so what you see in the bar at the bottom, the pale green section, reflects what we call the adjustment tolerance. And this is, it goes from a low limit to a high limit, or adjustment limit, if you like. And when the calibration technician is checking the calibration of that instrument, if the as found readings fall inside of the adjustment tolerance, that's great. Everything's good and there's no need to adjust the instrument at all. However, moving to the next block up in the graphic, where we see calibration tolerance, if the as found readings of the instrument fall outside of that adjustment tolerance, but they're still within acceptable calibration limits, then this means that those readings that are taken fall into the pale yellow blocks that you see on the left and right of the central green block. And in this case, it will be necessary to adjust the instrument to bring its accuracy back to within the green range, back to within the adjustment tolerance range. Okay, and so the top and bottom of that calibration tolerance are what we call the lower calibration limit and the upper calibration limit. The next one up defines the process tolerance. And here, the as found readings fall outside of the calibration tolerance range, but still within acceptable limits for the process. So adjustment is required, or the instrument must be replaced if it's deemed faulty after some sort of investigation. Within this range, there should be no impact on product quality, so typically no deviation would be required, but a non-conformance report would be generated. And again, I'm talking about the Blue Mountain software, which has that non-conformance functionality as a standard feature. So in this case, the readings, the as found readings, would fall into the gold colored areas to the left and right of the bar down the bottom. And up at the very top of the diagram, we find process failure. So in this case, the as found readings would fall outside the acceptable limits for the process. So on the colored bar at the bottom, the as found readings would fall into the red areas on the far left and the far right of that band. In this case, the instrument has exceeded its calibration and must be adjusted. It's also a good idea to investigate the device calibration history and replace it if it's deemed faulty, or if we find that it requires repeated adjustments or repeatedly falls outside of this tolerance. In this case, a non-conformance report and a deviation must be raised to assess the impact on product quality. So hopefully that talks you through the different levels and gives you some understanding of how they relate one to another. Ryan, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That is a really good overview and image of of everything we talked about related to the various types of tolerances within your program. So a couple more slides here, guys, before we get to some of your questions. We want to talk about unveiling trends in your calibration data. Monitoring these key trends within your calibration program can really help identify potential issues early and ensure that ongoing compliance stays intact. So here's a couple things that we're going to want to look to monitor. Of course, calibration due dates and compliance. So as you're doing your work throughout the month, you want to make sure that we're monitoring these for upcoming calibrations to ensure that instruments are calibrated within their defined service intervals. And you want to track and report on the percentage of completed items that are calibrated on time to make sure that your vendors and your in-house personnel are staying up to date with their services. As you see out of tolerance or out of specification events, you're going to keep track of those related to measurements taken with calibrated instruments. Investigations on these can help determine whether they were a calibration issue and what appropriate action to take and how often something is failing, whether you want to reduce that interval or not. And then in the previous slide, Dave talked about adjustments. So some customers will choose to monitor how often they're adjusting a device. Maybe it wasn't outside of calibration, but every time you're servicing it, there's an adjustment to be performed. You may want to do a deeper look into that. Maybe the instrument's starting to drift more often than it should and maybe need replacement. And then finally, we have our calibration frequency evaluation. We talked about measuring and monitoring your calibration frequencies if a device is failing often, to reduce it by half or when to extend that. So regular reviews of your calibration intervals for these instruments ensure that they're still appropriate based on your risk assessment and that historical performance. And then finally, continuous improvement. In this industry, continuous improvement is going to be wrapped around anything that we do. So you want to take the time to evaluate the overall effectiveness of your calibration and maintenance program throughout periodic assessments and reviews. And you're going to want to implement some of these improvements based on trends and feedback. So as we come to a close here, some key takeaways just as a reminder, in the building a sustainable calibration maintenance management program, we talked about master program and discipline-based SOPs. We talked about the importance of classification of instruments, and not all instruments are created equal. We talked about how to define and review calibration and process tolerances, why an OOT investigation is a critical part of this program, how to use risks to establish your service intervals and calibration tolerances, understanding how to manage history files, whether it be paper or electronic, and of course, the best practices for managing vendor calibrations in VM-RAM. And then finally, we talked a lot about how to harness the power of VM-RAM or another CMS to really maximize your program. So at this time, I just want to thank you guys for your time, and we'd love to have any questions, answer any questions that you have.
Sure, I have a couple of questions that have come in. Dave, if you could go back, I believe it was slide 27. The question was that equipment master record an export from VM-RAM?
Help me out.
There's your equipment master record, yeah. And so I think this is an example of a master equipment record from Qantas. Brian, correct?
Yeah, that's something that we created just as an example that we've seen in a couple different systems that we've worked with, but I don't believe that's an output right from VM-RAM. I don't know if it could be set up to look like that, but I'm sure you have some customization available there.
It can through a report, absolutely.
Okay,
that's not a problem. Another question that had come in is, can you comment on appropriateness of single point versus multi-point cals?
I'll take that if you don't mind, Dave. That's a really good question. We get that a lot. And most auditors and regulatory agencies are going to look for you to have a multi-point calibration done on an instrument that's used over a range within a process. So for example, if there's a temperature transmitter on an autoclave, you're going to want to calibrate that throughout a good defined range within the sterilization process. But if you have an ambient monitoring device or a controlled environment, such as a freezer or refrigerator, those are typically calibrated at a single point, and we recommend doing those at the point in which they operate. Of course, they cycle slightly around that, that set point, but it's going to create a lot of difficulty doing a multi-point calibration on a controlled environment, such as a -80 freezer. Conversely, if you have a building monitoring system or an EMS system with a probe that's monitoring that device and it's easily removable, that might be an instrument that you could take out, put in a block, and do a multi-point calibration, because that's going to be your point of warning if you are seeing a trend outside of your set point.
Excellent. Next question. Could you comment high level on the definition of a loop and a system feature? And I think that's specific to BMRAM is my guess. So I'll field that. From a loop perspective, the intent of the loop is an instrument loop. So you have your sensor, your transmitter, and a display potentially, or a chart recorder, right, that you would have as loop members, and you calibrate that as a loop. Typically, you're calibrating that entire loop when you do a calibration. The system is an asset that is a parent asset. So an example, your autoclave is the system. Then you'll have your instruments potentially as equipment under that as children. Hopefully that gives you some clarification and answers that question thoroughly. Let's see, what else? Here's another question. We have been using BMRAM for approximately 1 year. We have not yet introduced the notifications for asset owners for review and NCR items. There's hesitancy to turn on the notifications because of expected initial overwhelming the users. Can we soften the initial notification rollout? Yeah, that's something that I would certainly reach out to either the project manager that you were working with, your AE that you were working with. There are options, again, more so in the R4 platform. So certainly reach out to the your team to ask what your options are with the platform you're on. And then one other question we had that came in, and we're going to have to wrap up because we're hitting time. Regarding service intervals for calibrating instruments, you talked about service intervals of 3, 6, and 12 months. Is it always necessary to perform calibrations at those intervals, or can you choose an interval somewhere in between, for example, every 9 months?
I could take that quickly. You can choose any interval that is related or respective to your process that makes sense from your risk assessment. I haven't personally seen like a 9-month interval. We typically see them in more of a 3-month interval, 3, 6, and 12. I have seen some instruments that are super critical that people have us calibrate every single month. Although that's rare, it is sometimes exercised. But yes, you can choose any interval that you like that's within the related risk associated with your device, making sure that it maintains good compliance.
So I'm looking at one last, and we're at time, but I'll raise this quickly. So it's just trying to see, because it's a long question here. We're currently using R4, and let me just see here. Our external vendor conducted the calibration, supplied the physical report. We uploaded the report into the result file to obtain QA approval. My question is, when the FDA or any other regulatory agency requires the calibration report, how can we provide this calibration certificate along with the report on the same page? How other customers doing to tackle? So you can't on the same page. That's the unfortunate part, and that is not a RAM or a BMRAM restriction. It is really a SQL restriction. It's got nothing to do, it's a Microsoft restriction. It won't allow us to print the attachment with the report. So yes, you have to print the calibration work report as well as the vendor certificate. And I would just staple them together as they go hand in hand and present to the FDA, stamping them copy. And that is a wrap for today. We are at our time limit. The recording from today's webinar will be made available for Blue Mountain customers in the Blue Mountain Help Center. We'll also be sharing this webinar via email in the coming days. This concludes our webinar. We thank everybody for joining and participating during the session, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Thank you, Chris.